Life in the small town of Clearwater was nothing extraordinary, and that's just how it suited her. For as long as anyone could remember, Margaret had lived quietly on the outskirts, far away from the hustle and bustle of city life. The town, with its old brick buildings and small houses dotting the landscape, was a place where people knew each other by name, but not much else. It had its charm but not much excitement to offer. To most, it was simply a place to live out the years quietly, raising families and going through the motions of daily life. To Margaret, though, it was everything she had ever wanted. It had been years since she'd made the decision to leave the big city behind. After the passing of her husband, she'd realized that the life they had built together in the busy streets and fast-paced world of the city had lost its warmth. The apartment they once called home now felt like a tomb filled with memories she could no longer bear. The decision to leave had been an easy one. A simpler life, away from everything that had weighed her down, seemed like the only option. She sold their place and used the money to buy a small plot of land on the outskirts of Clearwater. There, she built a tiny house, a modest but comfortable home. It wasn't much, but it was perfect. The little wooden cabin sat on a patch of land surrounded by towering trees and wildflowers. The sound of birds in the morning, the rustling of leaves in the wind, and the distant sound of the river flowing were the only noises she ever heard. It was peaceful, and Margaret loved it. The house wasn't big, just one room, a tiny kitchen, and a loft. But for her, it was everything she needed. Each day she would rise with the sun, tend to her garden, bake bread, and spend hours reading books at the small wooden table by the window. It was a quiet routine, but it was a good one. Sometimes she would walk into town to help out at the local library, organizing the shelves or assisting the librarian with tasks. It gave her a sense of purpose, and she loved being part of the community. Life had become peaceful, but there was one thing Margaret couldn't shake off: the land itself. There was something about it that seemed off, not in a bad way, but in a way that made her curious. The house was built on a piece of property that was, in many ways, forgotten by time. It was just one of many patches of land left untouched, overlooked by most. But Margaret had done a little research when she first moved in, and discovered that this land had a history. A long time ago, it had been part of a mining town, a place where men worked tirelessly to pull gold out of the earth. The town had faded away, though, after the gold ran out. All that remained were the overgrown remnants of old shacks and empty, rusted tools scattered across the land. But it wasn't the history of the town that intrigued Margaret. It was the land itself. Every so often, when she was working in the garden or cleaning the yard, she would hear a faint clink or thud, like metal against stone, coming from the ground beneath her feet. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, but the more she heard it, the more curious she became. What was buried beneath the soil? She hadn't seen any signs of an old mine shaft, but there was something different about the earth here. On one particularly warm afternoon, Margaret decided to dig a small hole in the corner of her yard near the fence. It wasn't a big hole, just a couple of feet down, but when her shovel hit something hard, it made her pause. She could feel the resistance under the blade, and the sound was not what she expected. Instead of the usual soft earth, it was a dull, metallic thud. Pushing the shovel deeper, she soon uncovered a rusted metal box, small but heavy. It was buried deep enough that only the faintest outline could be seen at first, but now it was completely exposed, its edges sharp with age. Margaret's heart skipped a beat as she kneeled beside the box. It wasn't something she had expected to find, but there it was. A box hidden beneath her very feet. For a moment, she simply stared at it, unsure of what to do. Should she call someone? Maybe the local authorities? She had no idea what it might contain. It could just be junk, some forgotten relic from the past left behind by the miners who had once worked the land. But the curiosity inside her was too strong to ignore. Margaret reached down and brushed the dirt away from the box. It was made of iron, and the surface was covered in a thick layer of rust. The box was small, maybe the size of a shoebox, and it seemed as though it had been buried for decades. She grasped the edges and pulled. It didn't budge at first, but with a little more force, she managed to loosen it enough to lift it from the hole. It was heavier than it looked, and she couldn't help but wonder what might be inside. She sat back on her heels, holding the box in her hands. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting a warm glow over the scene, but Margaret felt a chill run through her as she turned the box over in her hands. There was no latch, no obvious way to open it. It was sealed shut, as though it had been made to keep its contents hidden. After a few moments, Margaret stood up and walked carefully to her porch, the box cradled in her arms. She sat down on the wooden steps, studying the box as though it might hold the secrets of the world. She couldn't explain why, but there was something about this moment that felt important. It was as though the land itself had been waiting for her to uncover it, waiting for the right person to find whatever it was that had been buried all those years ago. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. Margaret didn't want to open the box right then. She wasn't sure why, but she felt as though she needed to wait. Perhaps it was because, deep down, she knew that whatever was inside could change everything. This wasn't just some ordinary find, it was something that had been hidden for far too long. She could feel it in her bones. For the rest of the evening, Margaret sat quietly on the porch, the box beside her. She didn't open it. She didn't even try to pry it open. Instead, she stared out at the land, her mind racing with possibilities. What had she just uncovered? And why did she feel so drawn to it? As the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, Margaret finally stood up, gathered her things, and went inside. But even as she lay in bed that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. She had no idea what it would be, but she knew that the next day she would have to face whatever was inside that box. And in her gut, she could feel that whatever it wasn't going to be anything she had ever imagined. The tiny house that had once seemed so perfect, so simple, now felt like a fragile shell, and Margaret was about to find out just how much more there was to the life she had chosen. And deep inside, she had an unsettling sense that the discovery she had made wasn't just about history, it was about her future, and it was a future she wasn't prepared for. The next morning, Margaret woke up early, as she always did, to the soft chirping of birds outside her window. The sun had barely risen, but already the soft light was creeping over the edges of the trees that surrounded her tiny house. For a moment she felt a strange sense of calm, as if the whole world had paused for a moment, allowing her to collect her thoughts. But as the events of the previous day rushed back to her mind, she knew she couldn't let the day go by without finding out what was inside that box. The curiosity that had started as a faint whisper the day before had now grown into something louder, something she couldn't ignore. Margaret dressed quickly, her mind focused on the task at hand. She didn't want to waste any time. There was a part of her that felt like she needed to act fast, as if the secret buried under her feet had already been waiting too long. Maybe it was silly, but it felt like time was slipping away from her. She stepped outside, the air crisp with the early morning chill. The small patch of earth she'd dug the day before was still there, untouched. The box resting next to her porch was a silent reminder of the mystery that had begun to unfold. Her hands trembled a little as she picked it up again. The weight of it felt different now, heavier with the knowledge of what might be hidden inside. She had to know. Margaret sat down on the porch steps, her heart beating faster than usual. She took a deep breath and tried to steady her nerves. For all the years she had lived in this small town, for all the quiet moments she had spent working in her garden or reading books, she had never imagined that anything like this could happen. It was like her life had suddenly taken a turn she hadn't asked for, and now she was left to figure out where it would lead. She placed the box on her lap and examined it closely. The rust on the surface was thick, and there were no obvious signs of a latch or lock. The metal was worn and weathered, but it still seemed solid. Her curiosity grew even more. What could possibly be inside? She couldn't help but imagine all sorts of things. Maybe it was filled with old coins or trinkets, relics from a time long past. Or perhaps it was something more valuable, something that had been hidden away for a reason. Margaret found herself wishing she had someone to share this with, someone who might be able to help her make sense of it all. She had met a few people in town, mostly through her work at the library, but none of them were really close friends. Tom, the local historian, was probably the most knowledgeable person she knew when it came to the area's past. He had always been a little eccentric, with his wide-brimmed hats and long, unkempt beard, but he had a wealth of knowledge about the history of Clearwater. Maybe he could help. It was still early, but Margaret decided to pay him a visit. She wasn't sure what to expect, but the thought of having someone to talk to made her feel a little better. She stood up, grabbed the box, and placed it gently in the back of her small truck. The drive to Tom's house was short, just a few miles through winding country roads. The sun had fully risen now, casting a golden light over the fields and forests that stretched out on either side. When she arrived at Tom's house, she could see him through the window, sitting at his desk and flipping through a stack of old books. He didn't notice her pull up, so she knocked gently on his door. Moments later, he appeared, looking just as he always did, scruffy and somewhat disheveled, but with a friendly smile that made Margaret feel at ease. "Margaret, what brings you out here so early?" Tom asked, his voice warm but with a hint of curiosity. "I found something," Margaret said, holding up the box, "and I thought you might be able to help me figure out what it is." Tom raised an eyebrow as he glanced at the box, clearly intrigued. "Well, come on in then. Let's take a look." Inside, Tom's house smelled of old paper and leather, like a place where time stood still. His shelves were filled with dusty books and artifacts from the town's past. It was a cozy, cluttered space, and it felt like the perfect place to solve a mystery. Margaret sat down at the table, placing the box in front of Tom. He leaned in, inspecting it with the same care that Margaret had shown earlier. He ran his fingers over the surface, brushing away some of the rust. There was a long pause as he studied the box, his eyes narrowing in concentration. "Well, this is something," he said, finally breaking the silence. "I can't say I've seen anything quite like this before." "Do you think it could be important?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling a little. "I mean, I don't know what's inside, but I just have this feeling that it's more than just old junk." Tom nodded slowly, his mind clearly working through the possibilities. "It's definitely old, that's for sure. This kind of metal was used in the 1800s. I'd guess it's probably from the gold rush days, or maybe even earlier. The question is, what's inside?" Margaret swallowed hard. She hadn't even thought about the possibility of it being valuable. What if it was full of gold coins or something else of immense worth? Her mind raced with the possibilities. Tom carefully picked at the rusted edges of the box, testing them with his fingers. "It's sealed tight. We'll need some tools to open it properly. I wouldn't want to damage it." Margaret agreed, and the two of them set to work. Tom found a few old tools in his garage, and together they gently pried the box open. As they lifted the lid, a cloud of dust rose into the air, and Margaret coughed, but her eyes were fixed on the contents of the box. Inside there was a mixture of old papers, a handful of small trinkets, and, perhaps most surprising, several small gold coins. Tom carefully lifted the coins, his eyes widening as he turned one over in his hand. Well, he murmured. "These aren't just any coins. These are from the California gold rush. I'd say they're worth quite a bit." Margaret felt a lump form in her throat. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Gold coins from the 1800s? And they had been sitting under her house this whole time? She had no idea what to do with this newfound knowledge, but one thing was clear. This discovery was bigger than anything she had ever imagined. "Do you think this could be part of a larger treasure?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom nodded, his face serious now. "It's possible. The gold rush brought a lot of wealth to this area, and some of it was lost or hidden when people moved on. This box could be one piece of a much larger puzzle." Margaret felt her heart race. Could it be that her quiet, simple life had just been turned upside down by this small box? And what was she supposed to do now? The thought of keeping the coins and whatever else might be hidden here crossed her mind, but she quickly pushed it aside. She had always been an honest person, and this wasn't her treasure to keep. But what if someone else wanted it? What if someone tried to take it from her? Tom seemed to sense her unease. "You'll need to be careful, Margaret. People have done crazy things for treasure in the past. If there's more buried on your property, it's only a matter of time before someone else tries to claim it." Margaret nodded, her thoughts racing. She knew Tom was right. This wasn't just about history anymore, it was about something much more dangerous. The treasure buried beneath her feet had the potential to change her life, but it also had the potential to put her in danger. She couldn't ignore that. As she left Tom's house later that morning, she felt a mix of excitement and fear. What had she uncovered? And what was she supposed to do next? The world had just become a lot more complicated, and Margaret wasn't sure she was ready for what was to come. The next few days passed in a blur for Margaret. She couldn't shake the feeling that everything in her life had shifted. The quiet, peaceful existence she had worked so hard to build seemed to have cracked open, exposing something much bigger and more dangerous than she had ever anticipated. The gold coins Tom had shown her weighed on her mind, their gleaming surfaces reflecting the sunlight in a way that made her heart skip a beat every time she thought about them. What did it all mean? And more importantly, what was she supposed to do next? That Saturday morning, Margaret decided to take action. She couldn't sit around worrying forever. She needed answers. There had to be something more to this, something beyond the coins in the box. After her conversation with Tom, she knew she couldn't keep the discovery to herself. If there was a treasure hidden under her tiny house, it wasn't just hers to claim. But she also didn't want to hand it over to just anyone. What if it was part of a larger historical find? Something that belonged to the community or the state? Or worse, what if there were others who knew about it and were already on their way to find it? The first thing she did was call the local authorities. The sheriff's office had always been friendly, even if not particularly busy. Margaret didn't expect them to be overly excited, but she felt it was the right thing to do. After explaining what she had found, they promised to send someone over to investigate. A part of her wanted to keep it a secret, to see what else she could uncover on her own, but she knew that wasn't the right path. It was nearly an hour before Sheriff Holt and his deputy arrived at her property. Margaret stood on her porch, nervously wringing her hands as they walked up the path. Holt was a tall man with graying hair and a stern face. He had a reputation for being reliable, if a bit by the book. His deputy, a younger man, looked around the property with interest, his eyes scanning the trees in the house. "Morning, Miss Dawson," Holt said, tipping his hat as he stepped onto the porch. "I hear you've got something interesting to show us." Margaret nodded and led them inside, where the box still sat on the small wooden table. Holt and his deputy both took a close look at it, their expressions unreadable. "So this is what you found?" Holt asked, running his fingers over the box just as Tom had done days earlier. "You didn't open it, did you?" "No, I didn't. I thought it would be best to let someone who knows what they're doing take a look," Margaret explained, her voice steady despite the nerves swirling in her stomach. Holt gave her a long look before turning to his deputy. "You know what this is, don't you?" The deputy, who had been inspecting the coins inside the box, nodded slowly. "Looks like Gold Rush era coins." "Could be worth something, Sheriff." Margaret's heart skipped again. Gold Rush era? She had never thought of it in that context. She had always imagined it as a relic, maybe something from an old miner's stash, but never something that could be tied directly to the historical significance of the gold rush itself. Holt seemed to be thinking the same thing. "Well, we'll need to get this documented, of course," he said, tapping his finger on the coins. "But it's not something we're going to just let slide. We'll have to involve the State Historical Society. This could be a big deal." Margaret nodded, though she couldn't help but feel a twinge of worry. What if they took it all away? What if, in their eyes, she had no claim to it? The thought of losing it all made her uneasy. It wasn't just about the money or the treasure. It was about the discovery itself, the excitement of knowing that something valuable had been hidden beneath her feet for all these years. "Is there any way we can keep it? At least for now?" she asked, her voice small but determined. "I don't want to get anyone's hopes up, but I've always thought this land had something special about it. And now with this," Sheriff Holt looked at her carefully, his expression softening just a little. "I understand. But you have to understand, Miss Dawson, this isn't just yours anymore. The state might want to take control of it given its historical value. If there's more hidden around here, we'll need to investigate thoroughly." Margaret felt a knot in her stomach. She had never been one for confrontation, but something about this situation felt personal. This land, this house, had become hers over the years. It had become a part of her, and she didn't want to lose it, especially not to some distant bureaucracy. The discovery felt like a piece of her past had finally come to life, and it was hard to imagine anyone else taking it away. But Margaret knew she couldn't fight the law. She had to be patient and let things play out. So with a resigned sigh, she agreed to their plan. They would document everything, and they would send the information to the state. And Margaret would wait. That was all she could do. Over the next few days, the excitement in the small town of Clearwater started to build. Word had spread quickly about the discovery. People came by to ask questions, to see the box for themselves, and to speculate on what might be buried beneath Margaret's tiny house. Margaret tried to remain calm, but she couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by the attention. She wasn't used to being the center of attention. In fact, she had spent most of her life trying to avoid it. The next morning, the local newspaper showed up. A reporter named Rachel interviewed Margaret about the find, taking notes and snapping photos of the box. Margaret tried her best to keep her composure, but she could feel her nerves getting the best of her. She wasn't prepared for this kind of attention, and the thought of strangers poking around on her property made her uneasy. "Do you think you'll be keeping the treasure?" Rachel asked, her pen hovering over her notebook. "What are your plans for it?" Margaret hesitated. "I haven't really thought about it," she replied honestly. "I think it's best if the state handles it. I don't want to get caught up in something I don't fully understand." Rachel nodded, but Margaret could tell she wasn't entirely satisfied with that answer. The reporter had a way of probing, asking questions that made Margaret feel like there was something more she was supposed to say. But the truth was, Margaret didn't have a clear plan. She had no idea what was going to happen next. She just knew she needed time to think. As the day wore on, the feeling of being watched only intensified. People from town came and went, some with good intentions, others with their own ideas about what should happen next. Margaret tried to keep her distance from it all, retreating into the quiet of her house whenever she could. The coins and the box were still there, but they felt further away now, like something that belonged to a different world. That evening, as she sat at her kitchen table, a knock came at the door. It was Tom. "Margaret, I thought I'd check in," he said, his voice gentle. "How are you holding up?" Margaret stood up and led him inside. "I'm fine, Tom, just overwhelmed, I guess. Everyone is asking questions and I'm not sure what to do." Tom gave her a reassuring smile. "You're doing the right thing. Let the authorities handle it. Just take it one step at a time." Margaret nodded, grateful for his calm demeanor, but deep down she couldn't shake the feeling that things were moving too fast. The treasure, the attention, it was all becoming too much to handle. She needed space, time to think. As the sun set and the house grew quiet, Margaret stared out the window at the land surrounding her. She had always loved the stillness of the place, the way the trees seemed to whisper in the wind, but now the silence felt oppressive. What if there was more buried beneath her feet? What if this was just the beginning of something far more complicated than she had ever imagined? The mystery had only deepened, and Margaret was no closer to understanding what was really at stake. She felt both excited and terrified of what the future might hold. Whatever was hidden under her tiny house wasn't just a treasure. It was a door to something larger, something that could change her life in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. Days passed since the discovery of the box, and Margaret found herself slowly slipping into a new rhythm. The once quiet life she had carefully built around her small house was now filled with whispers and questions. The town had become abuzz with speculation, and as much as Margaret tried to retreat into her normal routine, she couldn't escape the reality of what had happened. News spread quickly, and now it seemed like every local resident had an opinion on what she should do with the treasure, or what it might mean for the town. For the most part, people were friendly, even supportive. Some came by with pies or baskets of vegetables from their gardens, offering comfort and advice. Others, however, seemed more interested in the potential value of the coins, their eyes gleaming as they asked questions. Margaret could see the glint of greed in some of their gazes, and it made her uneasy. She had never wanted attention, and now it felt like she was the center of a storm. Even though Sheriff Holt had promised that they would handle the situation, it was clear that the discovery was attracting all sorts of attention. Margaret knew it wasn't just about the coins anymore. If there were more treasure buried beneath her house, someone would find it. And once that happened, things would change. People would fight for what they thought was theirs. It wasn't just about a few coins. It was about a treasure that could change everything. One afternoon, after the latest wave of visitors had come and gone, Margaret sat in the living room, staring out the window. She was tired, physically and mentally. The weight of it all was starting to feel too heavy. She thought back to the simple days before the box, when her biggest concern had been tending to her garden or fixing a leaky faucet. Now every part of her life felt under a microscope. Margaret wasn't sure what to do next. She thought about calling Tom again, but he was already aware of the situation and had his own thoughts on it. She didn't want to burden him with her worries. Besides, he had already helped as much as he could. She needed something more. Someone who could see beyond the treasure and help her figure out what was really going on. The next day, while Margaret was out for a walk, she noticed something strange. A man she had never seen before was standing near the edge of her property, looking out toward the forest. He seemed out of place, dressed in an old jacket and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face. Margaret paused, watching him for a moment, unsure of whether she should approach him or not. Something about him seemed familiar, though she couldn't quite place it. Curiosity got the better of her and she decided to walk closer. "Can I help you?" she called out. The man turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment he didn't speak. Then with a slight smile he tipped his hat. "Just admiring the view," he said in a low voice. "Beautiful land you have here." Margaret studied him for a moment. There was something in his eyes, something that made her uncomfortable. Maybe it was the way he was watching her, or maybe it was the fact that he had appeared so suddenly. Either way, she didn't like the feeling he gave her. "I'm Margaret," she said, trying to sound friendly but firm. "Can I ask what brings you here?" The man hesitated before replying. "Name's Jacob. I've been doing some research in the area. Thought I might take a look around." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Research? What kind of research?" Jacob seemed to choose his words carefully. "Just some local history. You wouldn't believe the things people have left behind." It was an odd answer, but Margaret decided not to press him. Still, there was something about him that set off alarms in her head. She had learned over the years to trust her instincts, and right now they were telling her that Jacob wasn't just a casual passerby. "Well, I'll be going inside now," Margaret said, taking a step back. "If you need anything, let me know." Jacob nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. "I'll be around," he said cryptically, and with that, he turned and walked off toward the woods. Margaret stood there for a moment, watching him disappear into the trees. Her unease grew. Who was he, really? And why had he chosen her property to research? Something didn't add up. That evening, she called Sheriff Holt. She didn't want to make a big deal out of it, but the encounter with Jacob had unsettled her, and she felt it was better to be safe than sorry. Holt listened to her calmly, then assured her he would send someone to look into it. "I'll have Deputy Taylor keep an eye out," he said. "If anyone's up to something shady, we'll find out." Margaret thanked him and hung up, but the feeling of unease didn't go away. She couldn't shake the image of Jacob's eyes, the way he had looked at her like he knew something she didn't. It was as if he had already been aware of the treasure beneath her house. The next morning, Margaret decided to take a walk through the woods herself. She needed to clear her head, to focus on something other than the mystery that was consuming her. The trees were dense and the path was narrow, but she loved the peace that the forest brought her. It was where she had always felt closest to the earth, where she could let her thoughts drift and find a bit of clarity. As she walked, her mind wandered. She thought about the box, about the coins, about the possibility that there was more hidden beneath her home. What if she was sitting on a fortune? What if the treasure was meant for someone else? What if it was part of a story that had been forgotten, waiting for the right person to uncover it? But as she ventured deeper into the woods, she felt the same unsettling sensation creeping back. The quiet of the forest seemed to shift, as though something or someone was watching her. She paused, listening. All she could hear were the soft rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. But something felt off. She couldn't put her finger on it, but there was an undeniable tension in the air. A snap of a twig broke the silence, and Margaret froze. Her heart raced as she scanned the trees, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Was someone following her? The thought sent a chill down her spine. She turned quickly, hurrying back toward the path, but before she could take more than a few steps, she saw him again, Jacob. He was standing in the clearing ahead, watching her with an unreadable expression on his face. "Thought I might run into you," Jacob said, his voice calm but his gaze intense. "Funny, isn't it? How the past has a way of catching up with you." Margaret stopped in her tracks, every muscle in her body tensing. What did he mean? How did he know about the past? "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady, even though she was beginning to feel cornered. Jacob didn't move, but there was something about the way he stood there. His posture relaxed that made Margaret's instincts scream. He knew something, and he was waiting for her to figure it out. "The land you're standing on," Jacob said, his voice dropping lower. "It has a history that goes back much farther than you think." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" Jacob finally took a step closer. "People have been searching for what's hidden here for generations. Some think it's just a story, others, well, they've spent their lives trying to find it." Margaret's mind raced. Hidden treasure, a story passed down through generations. She had always felt like there was something special about her property, but she had never imagined it might be part of something bigger, a part of something that had been waiting for someone to uncover it. "Why are you telling me this?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob smiled, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. Because I think you're the one who was meant to find it. Margaret felt a rush of confusion, fear, and disbelief. What was he saying? Was he involved in all this somehow? Before she could respond, Jacob turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving Margaret standing there alone with her thoughts. The forest seemed even quieter now, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The next few days felt like a blur to Margaret. The more she thought about her encounter with Jacob in the woods, the more she felt the weight of his words. You're the one who was meant to find it. She couldn't shake the idea that there was more to this than just a simple treasure. Jacob's cryptic message echoed in her mind, making it impossible for her to focus on anything else. The sun had barely risen when Margaret woke up the next morning. The events of the past week had left her exhausted, both physically and emotionally. She had been trying to maintain a sense of normalcy, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. The excitement, the rumors, the constant questions from townsfolk, it was all too much. And now, with Jacob's strange warning hanging over her, it felt like the situation was slipping out of her control. As she sat at her kitchen table, sipping a cup of coffee, she knew she couldn't keep putting this off. She had to figure out what was hidden beneath her house. She had to understand why it mattered so much, not just to her, but to everyone who seemed to be showing up in her life. From the moment Tom had handed her the box to the strange encounter with Jacob, something had shifted. The stakes were higher than she had imagined, and the deeper she went, the more dangerous it felt. It wasn't long before Sheriff Holt's deputy, Taylor, stopped by again. He had been keeping a close eye on things since the discovery, and Margaret appreciated his regular visits. At least someone was looking out for her. "You okay?" Deputy Taylor asked as he stepped inside, glancing around the room. "You've got a lot on your plate, I can see that." Margaret gave him a tired smile. "I'm managing, I suppose, just trying to make sense of all this. I never expected any of this." "I understand," Taylor said, sitting down across from her. "You've been thrown into something bigger than you could have imagined. But you don't have to face it alone." She looked at him, trying to gauge if he was just being polite or if he genuinely meant what he said. "I appreciate that, really. But I still don't know what to make of it all. The coins, the box. Jacob's warning, it's like there's something I'm missing." Taylor frowned. "Jacob, huh? I heard about him. He's not exactly a regular around here, but he knows more than he lets on, that's for sure." Margaret felt a knot form in her stomach. "What do you mean?" "He's been coming around for years, always asking about the land, about the history of it. He's always been interested in the old stories. I wouldn't trust him if I were you." Margaret's heart sank. "I didn't trust him. Not after the way he talked to me. But I'm starting to think there's more to this than just some old treasure." Deputy Taylor leaned forward, his expression serious. "You're right. There's a reason Jacob's been so interested in this place for so long, and I think you're in the middle of something much bigger than you realize." Margaret's mind raced. She had always known that there was something special about her land, but she had never imagined that it might be connected to something so significant, something that involved Jacob and now, even the sheriff's department. The more she thought about it, the more confused she became. "So what do I do now?" she asked, her voice shaky. Taylor's gaze softened. "You need to be careful, Margaret. There are people out there who would do anything to get their hands on whatever's buried here, and they don't care who they hurt to get it." The weight of his words settled over her like a thick fog. For the first time, Margaret felt the true danger of the situation. This wasn't just about discovering an old treasure. This was about something that had been hidden for a reason, and there were people, dangerous people, who were determined to find it. "I've been thinking," Taylor continued, "maybe it's time to bring in some help. Someone who knows what they're doing. There's a local historian I trust. He's been researching the area for years. He might know more about this hidden treasure than anyone else." Margaret nodded. "That sounds like a good idea. I don't know who to trust anymore. It feels like everyone has their own agenda." "I'll reach out to him," Taylor said, standing up. "In the meantime, just stay alert. If you see anything unusual, don't hesitate to call me." After he left, Margaret felt a sense of dread settle in her chest. It wasn't just the mystery of the treasure that worried her anymore. It was the people who seemed to be drawn to it. What if Jacob wasn't the only one? What if there were others who had been searching for the treasure all along? And what would happen when they found it? The thought kept her up that night, tossing and turning in her bed. She couldn't remember the last time she had slept soundly. Every noise outside her house made her jump. Every shadow seemed menacing. The world outside her window had changed, and she didn't know how to handle it. The next morning, Margaret felt a little better. The night had given her some time to process everything, and now she was ready to take action. She wasn't going to sit idly by and wait for others to decide what happened to her property. She needed answers, and she wasn't going to stop until she got them. At noon, she received a call from Deputy Taylor. He had arranged for the historian to meet her at the local diner in an hour. His name was Mr. Dunlap, and he had lived in Clearwater for most of his life. If anyone knew anything about the hidden history of the land, it was him. When Margaret arrived at the diner, she saw him immediately. He was sitting at a booth near the back, a weathered man in his 60s with thick glasses and a stack of papers in front of him. He looked like someone who had spent years researching the past, and Margaret felt a flicker of hope. "Ms. Dawson?" he asked when she approached, looking up from his papers. "I'm glad to meet you. Deputy Taylor spoke highly of you." "Thank you," Margaret said, sitting down across from him. "I'm hoping you can help me. I've found something on my property, and I think it's part of something much bigger, but I don't know where to start." Mr. Dunlap leaned forward, his eyes twinkling with interest. "Well, you've come to the right place. I've spent years digging into the history of this area. There are stories, old ones, about treasures hidden by early settlers. Some say it's just legend, but I think there's more to it. What did you find?" Margaret hesitated for a moment before pulling out the box she had kept hidden away. She slid it across the table, and Mr. Dunlap took it carefully, inspecting it with a kind of reverence. He opened the lid slowly, his fingers brushing over the gold coins inside. "These are real," he said quietly. "Gold Rush era. But this box, this is something special. This isn't just a random find. This could be part of a larger story. There are old maps, legends of treasure hidden by people who knew this land well. People who were trying to protect it from outsiders." Margaret's heart raced. "Do you think there's more buried here?" Mr. Dunlap nodded slowly, his eyes still on the box. "I believe so, and I think it's tied to something much older than the gold rush. This land has been home to many stories, some dark, some forgotten, but it's possible that what you found is the key to unlocking them." Margaret sat back, her mind spinning. She had always known there was something special about her land, but this was more than she had ever imagined. "What do I do now?" she asked, feeling a mix of excitement and fear. Mr. Dunlap looked at her seriously. "You need to be cautious. There are people who will stop at nothing to get their hands on whatever is hidden here. They've been looking for it for years. But now that you've found the first piece, the game has changed." Margaret's hands trembled as she looked down at the box. She had no idea what she had just become a part of. But one thing was clear. Her life was never going to be the same.